My name is Kelly McKenna, and I'm the Executive Director of the Simcoe Muskoka Workforce Development Board and Literacy Network. And this is an Employment Ontario project that is partly funded by the Government of Canada and the Government of Ontario. So welcome. I would like to start today's webinar with a land acknowledgement. And while we meet today on this virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of these lands on which we work, live, and call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relations and our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this land home. And so welcome everyone, and thank you again for joining us today. We have quite a few people on the webinar today, and so we thought we would run a kind of introductory poll just to see who is joining us today. 54% of the participants today are with Employment Ontario Services. We've got just over 20 who are with our literacy and basic skills services. We have 26% from government community support services, and we have 3% from the private sector. So that's great. Thank you everyone for joining us. And maybe what I'll do with the second poll, we'd love to know who is from the Simcoe County area and who might be from the Muskoka area. So maybe we can just put that in the chat. If you guys want to just let us know what region you are from in the chat, that would be great. And we can take all that data and crunch it a little later. So that's fantastic. Thank you. Oh, great, Muskoka. Yay, great, 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 beautiful, very lovely, lovely. Thank you, everyone. That's beautiful. Wow, we've got great representation today. Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. So I'm just going to flip to the next slide and just tell you a little bit more about what we're going to be doing today. So we're going to take a deep dive into this year's local labor market plan for Simcoe County and the District of Muskoka. With our keynote speaker, Tom Zizys, who has really been crunching this data for us for over 15 years. And just to let you know, this year's local labor market plan is available for download on our website at smwdb.com. But today we have Tom with us, and Tom is going to take us on a deep dive of the data. But let me tell you a little bit more. He is a labor market analyst and a workforce development specialist. And for the last 15 years, Tom has undertaken numerous assignments on behalf of workforce planning boards, local governments, community colleges, and Employment Ontario service providers, and basically to investigate and propose solutions for our local labor market challenges of various communities across Ontario. He has written extensively on the changing labor market and its impact on income inequality, and on the need for labor market interventions to be demand-focused and evidence-based. We will have a Q&A with Tom at the end of the presentation. However, there's going to be a lot of data we're going through today, so if you are seeking any clarification during the presentation, please don't hesitate to pop your questions into the chat box, which you can find just at the bottom of the screen. And we will be monitoring it throughout the presentation. And so without further ado, I am going to hand it over to Tom. So please welcome Tom. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly, and good morning, everyone. As Kelly mentioned, this presentation is going to look at a number of the topics that were covered in the local labor market plan. We're calling this the continuing labor market turbulence after COVID. It's, I have to say, at least things are settling down finally. You know, we had a couple of years with COVID where we had, you know, incredible disruptions in terms of impacts on employment and on businesses and so on. And we'll see as we go over the labor market data that a lot of stuff is now starting to return to normal in a number of respects, but there's still some continuing and new issues that have emerged, particularly around job vacancies and the shortage of workers. So this presentation, oops, here we go. So there's essentially four categories of items I'm going to be covering. So we're going to look at labor market data around unemployment and participation rates and job vacancy rates and so on. We're going to look at some of the Employment Ontario client data to show what's changed, or what have been the trajectories in terms of client numbers and so on among the various Employment Ontario services. There was an employer survey that was done by the Simcoe Muskoka Workforce Development Board. So we're going to present the findings of that. And we have some data from the census that was carried out in 2021. So last year, I think we were able to present the first findings, which were only around population, but now we have some labor market data that was just released in November of 2022. So let's start with the unemployment rates. Now, I think I've mentioned before when I've done these presentations, and Kelly reminds me now, it's been 15 years. I tend to disaggregate the Ontario data because we have I almost want to say two distinct labor markets. We have the Toronto region, which in the data is typically measured by the Toronto Census Metropolitan Area. So that's the city of Toronto, essentially York Region, Peel, Durham, most of Halton, and small parts like just a few little corners of Simcoe and Dufferin are within the Census Metropolitan Area. That's an area that has a much higher proportion of individuals with university degrees, has a much higher proportion of jobs that typically require a university degree. And in the rest of Toronto, it kind of flips a bit differently, where there's a larger proportion of individuals who have college degrees, and we have a different mix than what we of jobs that are typically found in the Toronto area. And it really shows up when we look at what happened with the unemployment rate during COVID. So here we have the Ontario figures, which are in gray, the gray line. Toronto is the red line, and the rest of Ontario, so taking away the Toronto figures from the Ontario figures, is the blue line. So you could see, like at January 2020, the unemployment rate was virtually the same in all three areas. And when COVID hit in March 2020, it shot up everywhere, but it shot up much more in the Toronto region, around 4 percentage points higher at its peak in May 2020. The unemployment rate in the Toronto area was just above 16%, and whereas in the rest of Ontario, it was around closer to 12%. If you're only focusing on the Ontario figures, you wouldn't see that there's this discrepancy that emerged. The trajectory of the unemployment rate as COVID receded, gradually declined, but most of those bumps where it keeps going up were with the new lockdowns, right? Remember, we had the lockdown in January 2021, so we see a bump there. We had that short lockdown in January 2022. There's a bump there as well. But overall, the rates have declined, and we're at a stage now in this chart. It only shows up to January 2023, but I think that's actually because of the way the Excel table shows the figures. And this goes to February 2023. We've got the unemployment rates are essentially basically back to where they were in just before COVID. Right? So these are monthly figures because it's from the labor force survey. So the survey is has a sample. When you get to smaller geographies, we're going to see, I'll be showing the figures for Barrie in a moment. But I wanted to also just talk about the participation rate. So the participation rate measures residents 15 years and older who are in the labor market. And in the labor market means one is either employed or actively looking for work. And again, there's a discrepancy between the Toronto figures and the rest of Ontario, partly because just the age profile of the Toronto region is slightly younger than that of the rest of Ontario. So for that reason, it always has a higher participation rate. It has fewer people who are aged 55 years and older than are found in the rest of Ontario. But in all areas, again, the participation rate declined when the COVID hit. It dropped maybe around 10% or so, but recovered much faster than the unemployment rate. People, kind of were ready to go to work. They just that the jobs weren't available, right? Because there are a lot of the businesses that were shuttered for some time. And you can see that, again, there was ups and downs in terms of, partly this follows this kind of a cyclical pattern of employment increasing through the summer months, as people are taking on hospitality jobs and so on, and also tends to increase into the fall, then it declines during the winter months. But the main point here is if you look at the two ends from January 2020 to let's say January 2023, we're essentially back at the same participation rates, okay? And this is important because one of the things that people were thinking was that COVID caused people to drop out of the labor market. And that was part of the narrative. And it certainly seemed to be the case through 2021, that in many cases, the participation rates at sometimes were lower, but we're back to the same participation rates. People have not, in general, dropped out of the labor market. It didn't have as much of an impact as we thought it did. Locally, in terms of the unemployment rates, because of the smaller geographies, what we have is only data for the Barrie Census Metropolitan Area, which includes Innisfil and Springwater. And even at that size, the population doesn't provide a sufficiently robust sample. And so what Statistics Canada does is that it takes 3-month figures and averages them out in order to have a larger sample size so that the data is more reliable. So for example, if they're reporting for the month of May, it is the average of the data for May, April, and March. And so I've converted the rest of Ontario numbers and the Toronto CMA numbers to also be 3-month moving averages so that we can show the comparison. And by and large, the Barrie figures follow the rest of Ontario figures. They don't follow the Toronto figures. It's more the rest of Ontario. I think that's a point to make generally about the data. And when we're looking at Simcoe and Muskoka, even though, let's say, for the purposes of the ministry, where they designate an area as being the central region, and Simcoe Muskoka belongs to the central region with Toronto and Durham and York and Peel and Halton. In terms of the labor market data, Simcoe and Muskoka are far more like the rest of Ontario. The green line, which shows the Barrie figures, does show the Barrie numbers jumping a lot more when there's increases. It's very hard to assess whether that's because it's a smaller sample size, so it has greater volatility in terms of the numbers. But but overall, the trend is that the Barrie figures follow the rest of Ontario numbers. A few other things, and I know we covered this last year, so I'm just gonna reference again. With COVID, the great increase in unemployment was among youth. And here's the figures for those, the unemployment by age for monthly data. This is for all of Ontario now. So the green line is the youth from ages 15 to 24, and the orange line are adults. So you can see that in May of 2020, the youth unemployment rate almost reached 35%, whereas for adults, it was just slightly over 10%. It was around 11%. But again, over time, as the rates, as the unemployment rates receded, the figures came down, and we're back. And I've put the numbers up for the start and the end of this reporting period. We're essentially at the same unemployment rates we were before COVID. And, I don't think there's much we can quibble about between the difference between 10.1% and 10.7% for youth unemployment, and the adult rate of 4.6 and 4.2%. And it's historically the youth unemployment rate is always around 2 to 2.5 and sometimes 3 times that of adults. That's been the case since the 1970s. So there's nothing particularly unusual about that. And the reason why the youth unemployment rates spiked so much is because they tend to work more in the hospitality sector, and the retail sector, which was particularly affected by COVID. In terms of gender, the males and females, the red line here are the female figures, the blue lines, the male figures. It certainly was the case in the early stages of COVID that the female unemployment rate was higher than the male unemployment rate. And again, that has to do with what jobs people are in. So more women work in the service sector, particularly customer-facing occupations. And so they were more likely to be working in establishments that might have been closed during the lockdowns. And so their unemployment rates were higher. And you can see throughout the COVID period that many times the female unemployment rate spikes higher than the male unemployment rate. But again, over time, it's come back to where it was before. And the female unemployment rate typically is just a little bit lower than the male unemployment rate. When we look at the educational attainment of individuals, those who have a high school diploma or less, their unemployment rate again went up higher. And again, I'm going to keep on repeating the same story with service sector jobs like in restaurants and retail stores, with the higher unemployment and business closures in those areas. That's where the unemployment rate peaked, and it also was higher for those who worked in jobs that typically require a college diploma or a trade certificate. So that's the orange line. So you can see through the whole reporting period quite a number of times when that orange line is also higher than the red line. The red line had the lowest unemployment rate through most of that time, although it did get up to around as high as 8, almost 9% in the early stages of COVID. But this is the category of individuals who were more likely to be able to work from home because they had kind of jobs that could be done remotely using computers and so on. But again, in all these categories, the unemployment rate has returned back to where it was. Long-term unemployment. So long-term unemployment is the proportion of individuals who are unemployed 6 months or more. Okay? And here I'm giving a long view of things because the comparison is relevant. I wanted to include the data for what happened in the 2008 recession. So this data is annual data. It's for all of Ontario. It goes back to 2006 and up to 2022. So just before the recession, around 15% of Ontario's unemployed were unemployed long-term. The recession hits in late 2008, and by 2010, around a quarter of the unemployed, so 25.7%, are unemployed long-term. Even as the recession as we're recovering from the recession, it took a long time for that long-term unemployment figure to drop. It only reached the level it was before the recession around 10 years after the recession. And I remember I showed this slide last year, and last year we only had the figures, of course, only up until 2021. And I said, look at this. With COVID, the long-term unemployment rate has gone up even higher than the what happened after the recession in 2008. It reached almost 30%. It was at 29%, 29.4%. And I said at that time, and given the past history, this is going to be a real challenge, because we know it takes a long time for this long-term unemployment rate to drop. Well, that wasn't the case. This year, the figures come out, and you can see what a sharp drop there's been in the long-term unemployed. No one's going to say it's not a high figure, 19.6%, but it's fallen quite dramatically when we compare it to the historical trends that usually happen after a recession. Why is that? Because COVID was not a reflection of the health of the economy, right? We were dealing with a physical health challenge, which was the pandemic, and that's why businesses closed. So as we emerged from that, the underlying health of the economy was still present, and so hiring took place at a more rapid pace, and those, including those who were long-term unemployed, came back into the workforce very quickly. That's not to say that the drop is going to continue at the same trajectory, but it's certainly a promising sign that it's recovered so quickly in just 1 year. Okay, which leads us to the next issue. So as you've seen, the employment figures, the unemployment rates have come back to their historical or the pre-COVID levels. But as we know, as the economy opened up and became active again, there was a large push on hiring, and it's created challenges for employers in terms of finding a sufficient number of employees. So this is the data for job vacancy rates. So there's a separate survey that StatsCan carries out, which is called the Job Vacancy and Wage Survey, and they report it quarterly. So I give a longer term perspective here so we can see what the trends are like. So we're going back to quarter number 1 in 2018, all the way to the latest data we have is for quarter 3 of 2022. Now there's a gap in the middle through quarters 2 and 3 in 2020. And that is because at that time, StatsCan, because of COVID, they decided there was no point even collecting the data because it wasn't going to reflect accurately the state of the economy, because businesses were just closed because of the lockdowns. So that's why there's a gap there. And I have 3 sets of data here. Rest of Ontario. Then the other data is the way this data is presented by StatsCan. It's collected on the basis of what are called economic regions. So one region is called Kitchener-Waterloo-Barrie. So it includes Simcoe, and includes several of the census divisions in southwestern Ontario that include Kitchener and Waterloo. So it includes Wellington. And then the other one is Muskoka-Kawarthas. You can see, first of all, just eyeballing it, regardless of which line we're looking at, how the vacancy rate increased dramatically starting in 2021. And the red line is Muskoka-Kawarthas. It increased even that much more in that area. And I think I'm going to present another slide that may be one reason for why it increased, which is which industries were most affected. So here I've just isolated, and this is Ontario data, I've isolated a couple of industries just to make a comparison. So the red line is accommodation and food, right? Huge spike in the job vacancy rate there reaches over 12% in Q3 of 2021. What does that mean? 12%. Well, the job vacancy rate is the measure of jobs that are vacant divided by the total number of jobs that people are working in plus the number of vacant jobs. So essentially, 12% means that 1 out of 8 jobs in the accommodation and food services sector was vacant. Whereas, while the rates clearly went up in other categories like finance and insurance, the blue line, or administrative and support, which is the orange line, it was particularly pronounced in accommodation and food services. What's the reason for that? Well, at the time of the closures, individuals working in that sector, and I'd say to some extent in the retail trade sector, if they were working in a store that was a non-essential store and that was shuttered, yes, there were benefits that people could rely upon, but other individuals, for their own reasons, felt they needed employment, and they decided to switch into other sectors. They looked for work in other categories of other industries. And once the COVID restrictions were lifted, those individuals now were working somewhere else, and for whatever reasons, made the choice that where they're working presently was a better option for them rather than to returning to where they had worked before. So the pool of people who worked in a sector like accommodation and food services now shrank. It wasn't as if they were just sitting on the sidelines waiting for those establishments to reopen or for business to return. They were elsewhere, or they may have decided to go back to school, take advantage of that moment to get a certificate or a diploma that would allow them to advance into a different career. And so it's particularly pronounced that in this sector, the vacancy rates increased a lot because there just were less candidates who were applying for jobs in those sectors.
Tom, I have a question from the chat.
Yep.
Suzanne is wondering if North Simcoe is grouped into Kawartha or another area.
North Simcoe is grouped into the Kitchener-Waterloo Barrie area.
Thank you very much.
So when there's a increase where jobs are vacant and employers are having a hard time hiring, one option that employers have to attract workers is to increase their wages. So this is that job vacancy and wage survey also collects data on what is the median wage that's being offered in each of these categories. So here I've isolated just 3 categories. One is all industries, so that's the black line. So all job vacancies in Ontario, and the blue line is the accommodation services sector, and the red line is the food services and drinking places sector. You can see that there has been an increase, and it's the trend line on the right hand side is a bit higher, right? It's the wages have gone up, but they haven't gone up that much, kind of compared. If I go back to the slide on the job vacancy rates, the job vacancy rate has gone up much higher, especially in accommodation and food services. And some of that increase is actually the minimum wage increases that kicked in during those reporting periods. So there's been some response in terms of increased wages, but it's more muted than the degree to which job vacancy rates increased. Okay, just one other item I want to mention is about what was happening to businesses. So StatsCan collects several pieces of data, one of which is called looking at active businesses. So an active business is an establishment or a firm that has an employee in the current month. Okay, and if we count the number of businesses by each month, we can make some determination about whether that business was actually open or not, depending on whether it had an employee or not. And we're only looking at those businesses that have employees. So if they didn't have an employee, it suggests to us either they were temporarily closed or they were permanently closed. And instead of showing the actual numbers, because the number of businesses in Barrie and in Toronto is so different, right, in terms of the scale, that I choose to give the figure that was present in January 2020, I give it a value of 100, and every subsequent month, I'm reporting that figure in relation to that 100. So if it was 100 one month and the next month it's 105, it means there's 5% more businesses in that category. So long story short, COVID hits, the number of active businesses drops significantly, and you can see it drops much more in the Toronto area, which is the orange line, than it did in the rest of Ontario or in Barrie, which is the only other local figure for which we have data. And we have the slow, gradual, eventual recovery, increased much more rapidly in Barrie, and now the level of businesses there is around 6% higher than it was before COVID. But in all other instances, a number of businesses have also returned in Toronto and in the rest of Ontario, and it's slightly higher than where it was 2 years ago. You can see that at its worst in Toronto, the businesses declined just below that 85 level mark. So that means it was slightly more than 15% fewer businesses at the height of COVID. If we zero in on accommodation and food and beverages services, we can see that the decline there again was much higher. On the previous slide, it was just a bit before, the worst case scenario was just a bit before 85, below 85. Well, here in accommodation services and food and beverage services, you can see that the figures go down even below 75. So in May 2020, there were 25% fewer food and beverage services that were operating than there were in January. The figures have returned, but it's interesting that in food and beverage, in the rest of Ontario, we have just barely reached that 100 level. I think that's around 99%. Whereas in accommodation food services, it has now grown beyond the 100. So there's been almost a full recovery, but not quite. But in fact, because our population is growing, we actually should have slightly more services, businesses now than were present in January 2020. Now this is a very busy chart, so I'm going to let me just describe it this way. So StatsCan also does a thing called the Canadian Business Count, and it literally is, because they use administrative data and some sample survey data, and they are able to determine, it's virtually a census of the number of businesses that are present, and it's for all of Canada, and it measures also what industry they're in and how many employees they have. And we're able to get that data for areas like Simcoe and for Muskoka. And this data this survey, this count is measured every 6 months. So it's measured in June and it's measured in December. So what I do is I take the figure that was in June 2021, and I take the figure that was in June 2022, and in each of these categories, I say what was the change in number of businesses, and if it increased, then I color it green, and if it decreased, I color it orange. Last year, when we were measuring 2020 and 2021, there was much more orange. Okay, it's basically the story here. It's like playing battleships. There's much more orange in this chart. We've had now this surge in recovery where in all these categories, the number of businesses have increased. Now, this actually measures the number of businesses that are still legally open. Like, it's not just whether they were open and whether they had an employee or not. It's whether the business closed or not. So this is it's a much more there's more of a time lag in terms of the data here because it takes a while to legally wind down a business. And StatsCan does not like us doing these kinds of calculations because they say it's not a way to measure things, how things have changed over time. But I just draw your attention to the rows at the bottom of the table because I'm showing what the totals were when we reported this in 2019, 2020, in 2021, in 2020, 2021, that red arrow, and the most recent figures for 2021, 2022. You could see that last year, there was a clear drop in the number of businesses with 20 to 99 employees. We had 111 fewer of those businesses in Simcoe. For firms with 100 or more employees, we had 18 fewer. Well, that's significant. But in the last year, but over the last period, you can see how those numbers have rebounded, right? So we've had increases in those categories. One thing I'll just point out, there's this huge increase we see for firms with 0 employees. So that means it's just an owner run operation. Net total change in 2021, 2022. So if you look at that green line, we have 665 more businesses in that category. That's really driven. If you look at in the middle of the table in that column under 0, you can see that there's 791 more of these businesses in real estate and rental and leasing. What is that? That's mainly landlords. Those are the largest proportion in that category is landlords. So it's just, again, this everything that else is happening on the housing side during this whole period. You know, we all know about what kind of constraints there are in terms of rental housing. So this is more and more people renting out places and are registering as businesses in order to, you know, for this purpose. And so that's where that number is jumping up. Same thing for Muskoka. There's more cells that have zeros in them because there's just fewer number of businesses. So there's not as much change in these categories, especially in the 100 or more employees. In some of these categories, there's virtually no businesses that are in that sector. And so there's not as many, but still overall, the basic picture is there's also been growth in the number of businesses in Muskoka. If we look at those bottom rows, that green line of the most recent data, it's green across all those categories, 141 more businesses with 0 employees, 97 more businesses with 1 to 19 employees, and so on. And also the same thing, that in that 0 category, that number is really being driven by that in the middle of that column. You can see that 180 real estate and rental and leasing, again, landlords. Huge increase in the number of landlords that's driving those figures. Okay, let me just get to Employment Ontario data. So I've listed here, and I wanted to show over the last 5 years what the trends have been. So we've got 4 major categories, just as an indicator. So the employment services, assisted clients, number of assisted clients, literary and basic skills. I use the new in-person learner indicator, second career clients, and new apprentice registrations. And so when we list the board, that means the Simcoe, Muskoka area. And when we list the region, we're talking about the central region. So that's Toronto, Durham, York, Halton and Peel, and then the Ontario figures. Now, I have to say one thing about the employment services figures. For 2021, 2022, that figure is only for Simcoe, right? Because we had the service system manager data that now is for Muskoka Kawarthas was reported differently, and so we don't include it there. But again, the long and short of it is in 2020 and 2021, in most of these categories, we had a sharp decline in the number of new clients. And there's been a recovery in 2021, 2022, but typically not back to the pre-COVID level. The only place where the numbers came back was in the second career numbers. But the numbers there are so small that you know, I don't think that's, you know, very significant, but it's clear that the second career numbers did increase across the board, region and Ontario figures. But in all the other indicators, we're not back in 2021, 2022. We're not back to the year before COVID in the 2019, 2020, 2020 figures. A few areas to zero in on. When we look at EO assisted, so employment services assisted clients, to give it a context, I'm showing what proportion of the unemployed are in the different age categories. And you can see that, you know, in 2019 and then moving to 2020, that the proportion of youth who were the proportion of unemployed who were youth increased by a couple of percentage points. And then it drops off in 2021. It goes from 33% of the unemployed being youth to 27%. But the number of EO assisted clients who are youth is lower than that figure. And we have the, you know, if we look at the 2021, 2022 data, we see the age categories in these rows. So the youth were, you know, in 15 to 24 years old at the board level, they only make up around 18% of assisted clients. And it's pretty similar in the region in Ontario. In Muskoka, it was a slightly higher. There we do have the SSM figures for age. Maybe the thing I'll point out here that's interesting is the difference between the Muskoka figures and the board figures, which now only represent Simcoe. Muskoka has a slightly older population, so like 37% of the assisted clients in Muskoka were 45 to 64 years old. You know, just slightly more you could see compared to what it was in Simcoe. It's not a huge difference, but it certainly is the case that Muskoka has a slightly older age profile among its residents than Simcoe has. The one that really shows up as a difference is when we look at the source of income by clients. And I've just highlighted, you know, a few categories. So, you know, those who collect employment insurance, those who are clients of Ontario Works, those who are on Ontario Disability supports, or have no source of income, which means personally, not that their household, but that individual has no source of income, and then a catch-all other category. You look at Muskoka and you look at the Ontario Works. So now in Muskoka, under the service system manager regime that we have in place now, 35% of the clients are Ontario Works clients. Whereas you look across that row in all the other categories, it only makes up around 11 to 14%. And this is, you know, as those of you who are in this field know, this is, you know, one of the main changes that have been brought on with the service system manager model is a greater emphasis on serving individuals who are at greater risk of being long-term unemployed, and Ontario clients who are on Ontario Works fit that profile. Similarly, among ODSP clients, Muskoka is now at 12% of their clients are ODSP clients, which again is like 2 or 3 times what the figure is for in the rest of the province, because the rest of these other figures don't reflect SSM numbers. So when you look, if you're in Simcoe and you look at the SSM figures, this is what you can expect as you're going to move into the service system manager you know, changes that are coming. You're going to have far more clients who are Ontario Works clients, and also substantially more clients who are ODSP clients. One last thing in terms of the length of unemployed, and the main point I'm comparing here on the left-hand side, the current most recent data, and on the right-hand side, last year's data. And I'm just going to draw your eye to the last row that says clients who are unemployed for 12 months, for more than 12 months. So that now that we've come into the recovery stage, we have again more clients who've been unemployed for a longer period of time. You can see it's 33 to 34%, whereas the previous year it was only in the low 20s, because we have had an increase in the number of long-term unemployed. Okay, then finally, I just want to kind of, and I think I've shown this slide before, but let me just walk you through what this is about. So this is, again, employment services assisted clients. And the first column is the breakdown by their level of education, by their recorded level of education. So this is for all of Ontario, okay? This is all of Ontario figures. So among assisted clients, 30% have a university degree, 26% have a college or trade certificate, 34% have a high school diploma, and 10% do not have a high school diploma. They have no certificate. The next column shows which the job they were laid off of and the level of education typically required for that job. So that even though these individuals, 30% of them have a university degree, they're coming, only 15% of them are coming from jobs that require a university degree. A far greater portion of them are coming from jobs that actually don't require any education certificate. So it's like a cashier or a laborer, for example. And the third column is after, if they have an employment outcome after their time with Employment Ontario, where what kind of job does that, what kind of education does that job typically require? And there's a large increase in the number of jobs that require a high school diploma, and somewhat increase in the number of jobs that require no certificate. And it's and this is not, this is a bit of a knock against how our employment services were funded and what government expectations were about having what outcomes they're looking for. And you can see the outcomes are actually slightly worse than what they were in terms of the jobs they were laid off from. And I guess I certainly want to, pose the question is, even as we're moving to the SSM model, is this going to change? Is there enough that is being done in the SSM model that is going to allow employment service providers to provide the kind of support that allows people to transition upward as opposed to transition laterally or even transition downward? And I think that's something we're really going to want to monitor under the SSM. Just quickly, one other area looking at literacy and basic skills outcomes. The main point in terms of the difference between last year and this year, so the green line shows where there's been some increase at the board level in terms of outcomes, and the red line shows there's been a larger decrease. So let's start with the red line. So we look at the bottom, there's been a drop in the number of unknown outcomes. There's been a drop in the number of unemployed outcomes. And there's been a slight drop in the number of outcomes where people are ending up in education. That's been made up for increases in the category of people being employed and in education, and being employed and in training at the same time. So I'd say that's a positive outcome in terms of the trend of what's happening with these figures. I'm going to keep moving forward because I've still got a couple of things to share with you. So the Simcoe Muskoka Employer Survey. This is actually the 9th year that the board has carried out an employer survey. There was around 364 employers who went to the survey. The survey was carried out around late September to end of May. As always, we tend to have more firms in the manufacturing sector and a combination of food services and firms that have more than 20 employees. In fact, if we look at the largest firms in Simcoe and Muskoka, if we look at firms with 100 or more employees, there are 295 such firms in Simcoe and Muskoka, and 42 of them visited the survey. So 1 in 7 firms with a large number of employees visited the survey. Our survey focused primarily on recruitment, and we asked questions where we wanted to zero in on different kinds of occupations. So we have 3 categories we're using. We're talking about entry-level or low-skilled workers, so jobs that typically require a high school diploma or less, and you can see there are examples I've given there. Mid-level or mid-skilled workers, jobs usually required a trade certificate or post-secondary diploma. And senior or high-skilled workers, jobs usually requiring a post-secondary degree. Okay, these are categories that StatsCan has created, or how our national occupational classification code is how we distinguish between these jobs. So that's what we're following here.
Come and measure the rooms. He's not very nice about it.
So the first question was, have you done hiring in the previous 6 months? Have you tried to recruit? And you can see, certainly for entry-level and mid-level jobs, 70% or more of employers said, yes, we have been trying to recruit for entry-level or mid-level positions. A lower number saying they were recruiting for senior-level positions is 36%, but it's still a healthy number of job demand. We asked them, we broke it down by categories, and because we only have a limited number of categories because we wanted to make sure we had a robust enough sample here. But certainly in the services sector, accommodation and food, arts, entertainment, recreation, and retail trade, much higher proportion hiring for entry level, lower hiring for senior level. Whereas you look down the list and you go to places like healthcare and social assistance, or professional, scientific, and technical services, which are consulting firms, and law firms, accounting firms, engineering firms, there you have a healthy proportions in all categories. In fact, tend to even have higher proportions of hiring in mid and senior level jobs. Similarly, like construction is more on the entry level and mid-level, manufacturing is more on the entry level and mid-level. We asked them, how hard was it for you to find to recruit a new employee? And across the board, whether it's entry level, mid-level, or senior level, you can see most of them, almost 2/3 of them, are saying it was very challenging. And if it wasn't very challenging, it was somewhat challenging. Almost no one was saying it was not challenging. It was like, it's virtually in the single digits, right? Like that green bar, like 8 or 4 or 10% saying it was not at all challenging. So, and these are very high figures for them to say it was very challenging. And it was particularly challenging for the construction sector. You can see we've broken down by category of occupation. These are the proportions who are saying it was very challenging. So, oddly enough, like even manufacturing was a bit lower on the list, but construction, accommodation, and food services, especially at entry-level, mid-level positions, they were having a hard time finding employees. Healthcare and social assistance was higher for entry-level and for senior-level occupations. I'm not going to go into all the details here because it's always in the report, but these are kind of like the highlights I want to draw to your attention. We asked them, what were the issues that caused it to be challenging? Okay, and we would say, we gave them a list of options to choose from, and we said that this happened very often, sometimes, or not at all. And if it was very often, we assigned that answer a value of 2. If it was occurred sometimes, we gave that a value of 1. If not at all, we gave it a value of 0. Then we add up all the scores and divide it by the number of respondents. And so we get a composite score so we can compare across all these different categories. So long and short of it, in all 3 categories, the biggest problem was that just were a lack of job candidates. Okay, that was the biggest issue. The second biggest issue, it depended. For entry-level jobs, it was because they felt the job candidate did not appear job ready. Whereas for mid-level or senior level jobs, they said the individual lacked the experience they were looking for. And then for entry-level jobs, the third most common issue for entry level was lack of experience. For mid-level, it was lack of the educational qualifications. And for senior level, it was that people were expecting a higher wage than was being offered. Issues that were not coming up are shaded in, especially that scored low in terms of coming up frequently, are shaded in green. So it's issues like did not have the language skills we required, did not come up frequently. The transportation or commuting difficulties could not be overcome, came up more often. Job candidate was seeking hybrid or remote work. That did not come up often. And we're talking about entry level and mid-level positions. So you get a sense of the different kinds of concerns that employers have. I mean, there's a lot of stuff here that's provided. So there's different items that you can zero in on. But in terms of the 2 extremes, on the one hand, the big challenge, lack of job candidates and either not being job ready or not having the experience qualifications was the big takeaway. We asked them how they look for job candidates, and we've given the composite score again, and for entry level, mid-level, and senior level. But on the right-hand side, I made an average score across all 3 levels, so that I can rank them. And there's a high level of consistency of how they are recruiting. And the issue they raise most often is the main thing we try and do is ensure our wages are competitive. Then we post jobs online. We seek referrals from current employees. We post jobs on social media channels or on the company website, or we highlight training and advancement opportunities within the firm. The order of those 5 items, I mean, the top 2 are the same everywhere. Actually, I think they're the same. Yeah, they're the same everywhere. But then they kind of, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th kind of switches around depending on what kind of job. I think if you're recruiting for senior level jobs, they're more likely to be posting on social media or promoting advancement opportunities. We asked them what they felt was the soft skill that was most important for candidates for entry level occupations. So I'm emphasizing entry level, and we asked them to name 2. And so we broke down the responses for both the first response and the second response. And you can see that the number 1 issue, and especially when the first response, it's communication skills. So we did not suggest to them, we didn't ask them to tick off a box. We had them write this in. And so this is unprompted. They're saying communication skills is by far the thing that we look for the most for a job candidate for entry-level occupation. And you see that there's a mix of things, and it's always the same. It's that they're motivated, that they're friendly, pleasant, they have interpersonal skills, they're a team player, and they're reliable, dependable. But it's all it's all within that same category of, someone you can get along with and is reliable. But communication skills is clearly the big issue here.
Tom?
Yep.
I have a question in the chat from the slide previous to the soft skills slide.
Yep.
It was talking about the fact that they were surprised that lack of housing didn't come up. Was there a question around housing as it relates to hiring challenges? That's
a great question. So we did not put it there as a challenge in terms of the hiring, but there was at the end of the survey, we would ask, is there anything else you want to mention that comes to mind given what we've been asking in the survey? And by far, the item that was raised by employers, again, unprompted, was housing. And it was both in Muskoka and in Simcoe. But I think even more so in Muskoka. Yeah, so yes, absolutely. So we didn't bring it up, but they certainly pointed out that they felt that this was a real constraint for them when it came to hiring.
Thank you.
Okay. Now, I think I've got around 5 or 10 minutes left, so I think I'm going to move a bit quicker on this stuff, because I do want to share this stuff on the census. So this question we asked people about, we gave them a scenario that if you're having difficulty hiring, what do you do if you're not finding the right candidate? And we said, if you find someone who's got the right fit, would you hire them and then train them, or do you keep searching, or do you adjust the requirements of the job? And essentially, there was a slightly higher proportion of employers who said, we would probably hire for the soft skills and train as opposed to keep looking. What they're least likely to do is adjust the experience requirements or the education requirements for a job. There is some difference by industry. So accommodation food services will definitely more often hire for the soft skill, because I guess they feel that what they're training is easier to do. Whereas if you take something like manufacturing or even professional scientific and technical services, they're either more likely or just as likely to say, we're going to keep searching because we really need that skill. Okay. What they don't do is adjust the wage. The ones who are more likely to adjust the wage are in professional scientific and technical services and in retail trade. But that's kind of it's their third option when it comes to trying to attract employees. Finally, in terms of remote work, so we said, looking at your non-essential workers, now where are they working most of the time? And we said, if they're working 0% of the time at home, or 10% of the time, or 20%. So you can see 49% of employers said that their non-essential workers are spending 0% of time at home. But then there's, it's kind of, it scatters out, as you can see, like there's a small number in almost every other category. Well, we have to, it's really hard to compare this if you're looking over a number of reporting periods. So we cluster these 10 or 11 categories into 3 large categories. Okay, so it's either like, are they spending 0 to 20% of their time working from home? Are they spending 30 to 70% of their time working from home, or 80 to 100% of their time working from home? And because we've done this survey now several times, we have a measurement before COVID, which is the blue line, during COVID, which is the orange line. And then during COVID, we said, once COVID lifts, where do you think it's going to be? So that's what the green line is. We're saying, can you predict where you think it's going to be when COVID lifts? And now we have the purple line, which is what it is right now. So essentially, you can see in that first set of columns, the proportion of people who are working only 0 to 20% of the time from home has dropped by around, let's say, 15%. So now, from before COVID to now, 15% more of the non-essential workers are working working from home, and most of them are working from home kind of half of the time, like 30 to 70% of the time. But there's still a large part, there's 7% who are working from home almost all the time. Much higher figures than what it was before COVID, okay? But we are seeing this kind of this hybrid work that is emerging, which is a kind of half time from home, half the time in the workplace. And that proportions is actually higher among firms with 100 or more employees. They're saying that actually 33% of their workers are working in a hybrid situation compared to the ones who are firms with one to 99 employees. Far fewer are having many of their employees. So the real difference that's showing up in the labor market is that more larger firms are allowing more of their non-essential workers to work half-time from home. Okay, census. Okay, so bear with me. I'm going to try and do this in around 5 or so minutes. But the one thing I want to say about the census is that the census, as you know, we measure everyone, right? Like everyone gets counted in the census. So it's 100% sample, more or less, right? Maybe it's like 98 or 99%. But then we have a thing called the long form census. Well, we don't call it that anymore, but around 25% of people who complete the census are asked to fill out many more questions. That's where we get the data on their labor force involvement, on their immigration status, on a whole bunch of other questions, okay? And we do it so that's the best sample we have of what's happening in the country. So the census, when it comes out, it's this wonderful, mother lode of information. Like I look forward to the census the way some people look forward to the World Cup of soccer. Like I'm so excited when the census comes because it means there's so, it tells us about what's happening and it's so robust. The data is so reliable. Let me go back to this slide here. Remember I was showing the unemployment rate here. Well, the census was carried out when this green line shows up. So the census was carried out in May 2021. Well, things are kind of still wonky. Like we actually had people, like our unemployment rates were still coming down from COVID. And so it's not that, it's such a disappointment that this is actually not a great representation of the long-term trends in our labor market. So that's something I really wanted to communicate to you, because those of you who are going to be going to the census, you got to keep this caution in mind. And I'm going to illustrate that, for example, by the data that they show around place of work. Okay, so we have several categories of place of work: that you worked from home, or you worked outside Canada, or you had no fixed workplace. Like if you're in construction and you go to one job site one day and a different job site the next month, that's called no fixed workplace, or a usual place of work. So it means you go out of the home and you go to the same place all the time. So in 2016, we'll look at the bottom here. So that orange line, you see for Simcoe and Muskoka, work from home, we had 7% for Simcoe and 10% for Muskoka. In 2021, when this is being measured in May 2021, we now have 21% of people working from home. That's just not, that's not really true. They were working from home because of COVID. They weren't working from home because they have a home office and that's where they've always worked. That number is going to be higher because we have seen from the survey that there are more people working in a hybrid way, but StatsCan is probably now going to have to change the question, because we didn't have that much hybrid work before. Now this has become a reality and we're going to have to probe this more deeply. But the point I want to make is that how much different the figures are because of what was temporarily happening in the labor market. It shows up. So the other thing I'm just going to share is the industry figures, because this is always important to know. What's the profile of the labor market? Okay, and so these are the figures for Ontario. Now, let me just explain here again what's going on. So we have, in the first column, we have the actual number of residents who are employed in 2021. So at the top, we have all industries. We have almost 6.5 million people. The next column is the percentage change from the 2016 census, okay? Population in Ontario has gone up between 2016 and 2021, but the number of employed people went down because of that slide, right? We have a higher number of people unemployed. So we actually, in the census, we're showing a decline in the proportion of people employed. So I've shaded that red. And then I've highlighted where those drops have occurred. Like, what is the change between the 2021 and 2016? And if you go down to the bottom of this the last few rows, we look at arts, entertainment, and recreation, accommodation, and food services, declines of over a third, like minus 35.8%, minus 33%. Again, this is still COVID. Now, not to say that some of that hasn't lingered, but we have a very distorted picture of what's happening in the labor market. But there, you can see there's other categories as well where the employment has declined. Lastly, what I want to show is the green rows, the green colors indicate an industry where at least 7.5% of the workforce is employed in an industry. So I'm kind of highlighting what are the big employment categories. And so the share of employment, and I'm using the 2021 figures. So that's the last column, but I'm showing you 2016, 2011, 2006, so you can see what the trends have been. So what's the big trend is just the growth of employment in healthcare and social assistance. If you look at the bottom, the last green row, it's gone from 9.6% to 12.6%, you know, a huge increase. It is now the largest single employer in Ontario. If you go back to 2006, the largest single employer was manufacturing. It was 13.9%. And then retail trade, which was 11%. Like health and social assistance was third just 15 years ago. And now it's first. And you can see the other proportions there. Okay? So just to give you the highlights for Simcoe and Muskoka. So again, because Simcoe has grown more than the province, so it actually did not have an overall decline in employment, but there is decline. Again, if you go down, you can see arts and entertainment, a decline of 45%, accommodation and food services, a decline of 29%. Again, partly that's COVID. The four main sectors in Simcoe are construction, manufacturing, retail trade, and health and social assistance. And again, health and social assistance is the largest category now for employment. Yeah, so those are the other. Yeah, and you know, all the others, everything else is, you know, down around 6% or less of the labor force. Muskoka has only 3 sectors now that have at least 7.5% of the labor force. Construction, which is a huge 16.9%. Retail trade and healthcare. You can see construction is the largest, unlike in Simcoe, where health and care is the largest. Construction is the largest, retail trade is second, healthcare and social assistance is third. Because of the decline of employment in accommodation and food services, if we go down to that row of accommodation and food services, in 2016, that sector accounted for 9.2% of employment. So it would have been shaded green. But because of the decline of employment in 2021, sorry, it's now down to 5.7%. So it's shrunk its proportion of employment. It may come, it will come back. Yeah, I'm saying it will be up higher than 7.5%. But for the time being, it's at the time of the census being taken, it wasn't at that level. Okay. This slide is about educational attainment, and I'm pretty sure I'm out of time, so I'm not going to go into the details. I'm going to tell you that the story here is that there's still continuing growth in post-secondary education, but in Simcoe and Muskoka, where the college diploma or apprenticeship certificate is higher than that than the average, we are starting to see a slight shift now to more people going into a higher number going into university. Okay, it's still not surpassing colleges, university, but there's a trend where now maybe 10 years ago, the proportion of people who are going to college has actually gone down slightly compared to the proportion of people who are going to university in both Simcoe and Muskoka. And yeah, I was just going to highlight here, like if you look at 25 to 44-year-olds, the people who have no certificate, the number's gone down everywhere. Whereas the people in these post-secondary categories, compared to 2016, it's gone up for university and it's gone down slightly for college and apprenticeship. So,
Tom, I have a quick question.
Yep.
Celine wanted to know if you discussed the gender gap and the impact of lack of childcare or affordable childcare, if that was addressed.
We did not ask about childcare when we're talking about recruitment in the survey. In terms of the gender, if we broke down these educational figures, we would certainly see that there's a higher proportion of females who are going to university compared to males, and there's a higher proportion of females taking post-secondary generally than males, except of course in the apprenticeship category. But for college and university, a higher proportion of females going further in education than males, especially in Simcoe and Muskoka. But further that, and particularly among university, the female numbers are higher. Thanks, Celine, for your question. Okay, so just to kind of do the highlights, when someone asks you at dinner tonight what you did this morning, you heard a presentation where you heard that employment rates have now come back to pre-employment levels. Share of long-term unemployed has dropped, although it's still slightly higher than pre-COVID. Participation rates are back to pre-COVID levels. Job vacancy rates have risen significantly, especially in hospitality. Offered wage is only slightly higher. Number of businesses have returned pretty well to pre-COVID levels. 2/3 of employers are finding it very challenging to recruit new employees across all occupations. The main recruitment challenge is lack of job candidates, lack of experience, and for entry-level jobs not being job ready. There's been a shift of around 15% of non-essential workers towards more remote work and more hybrid remote work. Healthcare and social assistance now is increasing its share of employment. And this last issue, which is the slight shift from colleges into trades education to a university education. So I know there have been some questions during the course of the presentation about clarification on the slides, but there's some overall policy questions. We're happy to spend a few times discussing the implications of this data.
That's great. Thank you, Tom. I just love how you explain the numbers and help us really zero in on some of those important trends. I think we've answered all of the questions that have come so far in the chat, but I've got Salim who's got his hand up. So Salim, go ahead if you want to unmute yourself and ask Tom a question. Go ahead.
Sure. Hey, Tom. Great presentation. Thanks. If I'm in talking to employers, and there's a lot of stuff to parse through, what do you think the salient points I would be able to express them of they keep saying, well, there's nobody to hire. There was something on CBC about the migration of 50,000 people out of Ontario. So is there a narrative that I can maybe from this data talk to employers, at least let them know what does the landscape look like in maybe 3 points of where are the workers they keep asking, and I'm trying to get around.
So I think in part it depends on the sector, and I think especially in accommodation and food services, I think it's pretty clear that people have shifted out of that sector because of what happened during COVID, and they sought out careers elsewhere. But so especially for that category, but I think it applies to every category, and especially given where our demographics are going, because we are seeing the impact of a growing number of proportion of residents who are retiring. Employers are really going to have to up their game in terms of being employers of choice. This is not about people who are staying at home because our income support programs are too generous. It's about people being able to, they have the choice of where they want to work, and employers have to distinguish themselves in terms of not only the wage, but also, benefits, or, being more accommodating in terms of scheduling, and they're now going to be, they're competing with other employers, and they've got to, and also like even, employee engagement and giving people a sense that their contribution is worthwhile and that they're part of a team and that they have some fulfillment from their work and there's opportunities for advancement. It's that whole, like, it's things we've been talking about for some time, that we've been trying to say to employers that, you should be doing this. Well, now you almost have no choice but to do this. And it's not a knock against you. This is the way our labor market is, and this is the way it's going to be for some time. And you're not going to be able to you're not going to be able to compete with your competitors if you're not being an attractive employer.
I appreciate it. So it's not a supply, it is still a supply and demand issue though, is it not? Is it, again, I'll take a look at the stats closer, but is there less people, if I can just say it bluntly?
Well, at this point, it's not less people. It's a funny, that's the odd thing about that participation rate. I would have thought that the participation rate would have gone down.
Yeah.
I think there's probably, so here's the other thing. So that's the overall participation rate, right? I think I still have to crunch these numbers, but I think certainly over time, historically, the participation of youth has gone down, for example. Okay, so where are youth working in? Well, again, they're working in the service sector. It's the participation of youth has gone down because more of them are staying in school longer. When they're in school, they're now less likely than they were 20 years ago to be working part-time. If they are working, they are now looking for opportunities where they're going to further their postgraduate, their careers after graduating. So they're more likely to take an internship or a co-op placement rather than work part-time in a restaurant. So all of a sudden, that workforce that would have been there for certain categories, that's where the participation rate's gone down. It's not that, and also we have fewer youth, right? So that combined has really hit certain sectors very hard. Okay, and I think it's in a place like Muskoka, that's going to be a real challenge. Never mind the huge housing issues that anybody's facing in that community.
Yeah.
So I think that's there's the overall average figures, which, as I'm saying, no, we haven't had a reduction in the workforce. We might be having, on the other hand, we may be having this surge of hiring makes it appear like there's no workers because there are more people. Everyone's kind of, restocking. There's been shifts in terms of where people have decided now they're going to work, and they have choices to make. And so now certain areas are really struggling, but everyone's struggling because they're all hiring at the same time. And it's not as if it's all spread out over 12 or 24 months. Everyone's hiring as they're all coming out of COVID.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate it.
Yeah, that's great, Tom. I love how you can say the numbers are actually, the truth, and what we talk about is, colloquial in a way, of that gap in the workforce. We've got another question here from Nora. So Nora, I'll turn it over to you. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. Tom, I was just wondering, you did mention that females are more and more enrolling in university programs, especially in this area. Is there anywhere that data can be obtained? Is that something that you can see through Stats Canada, or even would you have that data? I'm just curious if there is any kind of information on what programs are they entering into.
Well, the entry data, I don't do much in that category. I know, there's a guy named Alex Usher who writes on higher education. He has a blog, And you know, he's had a blog for years, and he writes every day, and he often cites enrollment data, and there is enrollment data that is available. What I'm referring to is the educational attainment data. Okay, so the census data that I shared is not where they're enrolling, but what education they've acquired. And that data certainly shows, if you know, you compare over time, the increasing proportion, like female education rates have been rising more, including in Simcoe and Muskoka, and particularly more so in terms of university. And I can see if I have that handy, if that would be of use to you.
Yeah, it was, yeah, just curiosity around some other things we do, you know, what kind of education attainment that is being received. So, but thank you. Yeah.
I mean, the one drawback of the StatsCan data, of course, is that they kind of create this hierarchy, right? So that, you know, like a university degree is somehow considered higher than a college diploma. And so if you finish university and then you go back and you get a college degree, diploma, because you want to, you know, specialize in a particular career, StatsCan will still kind of say, well, you've got a university degree. So I think there's a bit of distortion there. Now there is some data that, you know, I know there are studies that StatsCan has done to look at the extent to which people who have university degrees go back to get a college degree. But so that is stuff, you know, that is available. Like you can do searches on the StatsCan site to seek out those studies, because they are there.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. That's great. We have hit 11 o'clock, Tom, and I just want to say thank you so much. We've even had comments. Excellent presentation, really well done. Thank you. You have a gift really for crunching those numbers, and like I said, just help us zeroing in on, you know, those workforce trends.
I just want to remind everyone that the link to our evaluation is in the chat.
Thank you, Sherry. Yes, so if we could get everyone to certainly take that survey. I've also popped in the chat where you can find this year's local labor market plan available for download, and all of the information is included in there. If you do have any follow-up questions for Tom or for ourselves, please don't hesitate to email us or call us, get in touch with us, and we can certainly help dig in and find some more of that data information for you. So, Tom, thank you so much for today. That was a marathon of data, so really appreciate you digesting and giving us that in a format that is so much more understandable. So thank you everyone for joining us. Again, if you'd like to find out more, please check out our website at smwdb.com. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone. Thanks for joining us today.